The crisp autumn wind whistled through the nearly empty park as Officer Chen made his final rounds for the night. 23 years on the force had taught him to notice the smallest details, a skill that would prove invaluable on this particular evening. As he swept his flashlight across the playground equipment, something caught his eye near the old oak tree, a small bundle of blankets that seemed oddly out of place. Drawing closer, his heart nearly stopped when he noticed a tiny hand clutching a worn teddy bear poking out from beneath the layers. There, curled up against the massive trunk, lay a girl who couldn't have been more than 12 years old, her face peaceful in sleep despite the harsh circumstances. Officer Chen had seen his share of heartbreaking situations, but something about this child's vulnerable state struck him deeply. He gently touched her shoulder, careful not to startle her. "Hey there, sweetheart. Are you okay?" The girl's eyes fluttered open, revealing a mixture of fear and exhaustion. She quickly scrambled to sit up, clutching her teddy bear tighter as she pressed herself against the tree. I'm sorry. Please don't make me leave, it's the only safe place I found." Her voice trembled with a combination of cold and fear, but there was something else in her tone that spoke of wisdom beyond her years. Officer Chen crouched down to her level, maintaining a safe distance to avoid frightening her further. "You're not in trouble. I just want to make sure you're safe. How long have you been out here?" The girl, who would later introduce herself as Amy, hesitated before whispering, 3 nights, I think. Maybe 4. The days kind of blur together now. She pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders, and Officer Chen noticed how it hung loosely on her small frame. As he sat there in the growing darkness, Officer Chen felt his police training giving way to his paternal instincts. He'd seen countless cases of runaways and troubled youth, but something in Amy's eyes told a different story. This wasn't rebellion or teenage angst, this was survival. "Would you like to tell me how you ended up here?" he asked softly, pulling out his thermos of still warm coffee. He offered it to her, and after a moment's hesitation, she accepted, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm container. Amy took a small sip, and as the warmth spread through her body, the words began to flow. She spoke of a home that had once been filled with love and laughter, of a mother who used to braid her hair every morning before school, and of how everything changed when illness struck their family like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. Her mother's medical bills had mounted rapidly, forcing them to move from their cozy apartment to a series of increasingly cramped spaces. Eventually, they ended up in their car, with Amy trying to maintain her school attendance while her mother grew weaker by the day. The final blow came when their car was towed, containing most of their remaining possessions. "Mom, she's in the hospital now," Amy explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "They said she needs to stay there, but I couldn't afford the shelter fees anymore. I didn't want to tell anyone because I was afraid they'd separate us forever. Mom's all I have left." Officer Chen felt tears welling up in his eyes as he listened to Amy's story. In his years of service, he'd encountered countless tales of hardship, but the quiet dignity with which this young girl faced her circumstances touched something deep within him. She wasn't asking for pity, she was simply trying to survive until she could be reunited with her mother. As Amy spoke, her story revealed the harsh realities of a healthcare system that could bankrupt families, of how quickly anyone could fall through society's cracks, and of a child's incredible resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. She explained how she still tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, using the park's water fountain to wash up before school, carefully rationing the few dollars she had left, and finding quiet corners of the library to do her homework until closing time. The autumn night grew colder as Amy's story unfolded, and Officer Chen realized that this encounter would change not only Amy's life but his own as well. As he sat there, listening to this brave young soul, he knew that his duty extended far beyond simply ensuring public safety, it was about being a beacon of hope for those who needed it most. What started as a routine patrol had transformed into a moment that would spark a chain of events, touching lives throughout the community and reminding everyone that sometimes the most profound acts of humanity begin with simply stopping to listen to someone's story. Officer Chen couldn't bring himself to simply follow standard protocol and call social services immediately. Years of experience had taught him that sometimes, the system needed a more personal touch. As the night grew deeper and the temperature continued to drop, he made a decision that would alter multiple lives forever. "Listen," he said gently, reaching for his phone. "I know you're scared of being separated from your mom, but you can't stay out here. I have an idea, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Amy looked at him with cautious hope, clutching her teddy bear as she nodded slowly. He called his wife, Rose, a retired nurse who had always possessed an uncanny ability to make anyone feel at home. As he explained the situation, Amy watched his face intently, trying to gauge what would happen to her. The conversation was brief, but by the end, Officer Chen was wearing a warm smile. "My wife is preparing a hot meal and a warm bed for you," he explained. "It's just temporary, until we can figure things out together. No one's going to separate you from your mom, you have my word." The relief that flooded Amy's face spoke volumes about the weight she'd been carrying on her young shoulders. The drive to Officer Chen's home was quiet but not uncomfortable. Amy sat in the back seat, taking in the warmth of the patrol car's heater, her teddy bear still clutched tightly to her chest. Through the rearview mirror, Officer Chen could see her fighting to stay awake, exhaustion finally catching up with her. Rose was waiting at the door when they arrived, her kind face illuminated by the porch light. She had already prepared their guest room and the smell of homemade soup wafted through the air. Amy's stomach growled audibly, reminding everyone that she hadn't had a proper meal in days. As Amy ate her soup at the kitchen table, Rose quietly tended to her immediate needs. She had already gathered some clean clothes that their daughter had outgrown, and the bathroom was stocked with fresh towels and toiletries. The simple acts of kindness brought tears to Amy's eyes, though she tried to hide them. "Tomorrow morning," Officer Chen said as Amy finished her meal, "we'll go to the hospital to see your mom. Then we can start working on finding a more permanent solution." Amy nearly dropped her spoon, hope and anxiety battling across her face. But how? "They won't let me stay with her, and we don't have anywhere to go," Amy's voice quivered with uncertainty. Rose reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. "One step at a time, sweetheart. First, you need a good night's sleep in a proper bed. Everything looks better in the morning light," Rose assured her, years of nursing experience evident in her calming tone. That night, as Amy slept soundly for the first time in weeks, Officer Chen and Rose sat at their kitchen table, making calls and formulating plans. They contacted the hospital's social worker, researched temporary housing options, and reached out to local community organizations they'd worked with over the years. The next morning, after a breakfast of pancakes that brought the first real smile to Amy's face, they headed to the hospital. The drive was tense with anticipation, but Officer Chen kept reassuring Amy that things would work out. He had seen too many similar situations resolve themselves not to believe in the power of community and compassion. Walking into the hospital room, Amy rushed to her mother's bedside. The reunion was emotional, with tears flowing freely as mother and daughter embraced. Amy's mother, Mrs. Lee, looked both relieved and guilt-ridden when she learned of her daughter's ordeal. "I'm so sorry, baby. I thought you were staying with Mrs. Thompson from church," she whispered, holding Amy close. The revelation that Amy had hidden her situation from everyone, including her mother, to protect their family brought fresh tears to everyone's eyes. Officer Chen and Rose watched from the doorway as the hospital's social worker joined them. Together, they began piecing together the complex puzzle of the Lee family's situation. The social worker, impressed by Amy's resilience and the Chen's commitment, immediately began working on connecting them with various support services. As the morning progressed, a plan began to take shape. The hospital's charitable foundation would help cover some of the medical bills. A local non-profit organization, hearing about their situation through Officer Chen's contacts, offered temporary housing assistance. Rose, drawing on her years of medical experience, helped navigate the complicated healthcare system to ensure Mrs. Lee would receive the ongoing care she needed. But perhaps most importantly, the Chens offered something that couldn't be provided by any organization or institution. They offered hope and stability during a time of crisis. They understood that sometimes the most valuable thing you can give someone is the chance to catch their breath and rebuild. As Officer Chen watched Amy sitting by her mother's hospital bed, sharing stories about the kindness she'd encountered, he reflected on how close this story came to having a very different ending. If he hadn't noticed that small bundle of blankets in the park, if he hadn't taken the time to listen, if his wife hadn't opened their home without hesitation, how many other Amys were out there, hiding in plain sight, trying to brave their storms alone? The day ended with a promise, not just the verbal kind, but the kind that transforms lives. The Chens would continue to support Amy and her mother through their journey back to stability. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be challenges ahead, but they would face them together. As they left the hospital that evening, Amy hugged Officer Chen tightly. "Thank you for seeing me," she whispered, and in those simple words lay the profound truth about what it means to truly serve and protect a community. Sometimes, it's not about the big gestures or dramatic rescues, it's about taking the time to really see someone in need and having the courage to reach out. Word of Amy and Mrs. Lee's situation spread through the community like ripples in a pond. It started small. Officer Chen mentioned it to his colleague at the precinct, Rose shared the story with her former nursing colleagues, and the hospital's social worker discussed it with local support organizations. Soon, what began as one family's private struggle transformed into a movement that showed the true heart of their community. The first surprise came from Amy's school. When her teachers learned about her situation, they were stunned by her determination to maintain her studies despite everything. Her math teacher realized that Amy had been completing her homework in the library every day, never letting on that she had nowhere else to go. The revelation sparked action throughout the school. The principal called an emergency staff meeting, and within days, they had organized a support system. The school counselor began working with Amy, helping her process the trauma of the past few months. The cafeteria staff made sure she had proper meals during school hours, and her teachers worked together to help her catch up on any lessons she had missed. But it was Amy's classmates who truly showed that kindness knows no age limit. When they learned that most of her belongings had been in the car when it was towed, they organized a donation drive. Soon, Amy had new clothes, school supplies, and even a brand new backpack. One girl even brought in a bracelet-making kit, remembering how Amy had once mentioned she loved making jewelry with her mom. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Mrs. Lee's condition was slowly improving, but the road to recovery would be long. The hospital's charitable foundation had covered a significant portion of the existing bills, but the ongoing treatment costs were still daunting. That's when Rose had an idea that would change everything. She reached out to her former colleagues at the hospital's rehabilitation center, where she had worked for over 2 decades. After hearing Mrs. Lee's story, they agreed to provide specialized care at a reduced rate. More importantly, they helped connect Mrs. Lee with a clinical trial for her condition, offering hope for a more effective treatment. Officer Chen's police precinct also stepped up in ways no one expected. His fellow officers, touched by Amy's story, started a fund to help recover the family's possessions from the impound lot. When they retrieved the car, they found that most of the Lee's belongings were still intact, including precious family photos and documents that Amy and her mother had feared were lost forever. The local church that Mrs. Lee had mentioned became another unexpected source of support. Though they hadn't known about the family's situation, once informed, they mobilized their congregation. Church members took turns visiting Mrs. Lee in the hospital, bringing home-cooked meals to the Chens for Amy, and offering prayers and companionship. One elderly church member, a retired social worker, helped navigate the complex web of social services available to the family. She spent hours filling out forms, making calls, and advocating on their behalf. Her expertise proved invaluable in securing temporary housing assistance and additional support services. The Chen's home had become a safe haven for Amy, but everyone knew it was a temporary solution. The goal was to help the Lee family regain their independence, not create a permanent dependency. Rose and Officer Chen worked tirelessly with various organizations to find a more sustainable living situation for when Mrs. Lee was released from the hospital. Their efforts paid off when a local housing nonprofit offered a small apartment at a reduced rate. It was nothing fancy, but it was clean, safe, and, most importantly, within walking distance of both Amy's school and the hospital's outpatient facility where Mrs. Lee would continue her treatment. Through all of this, Amy showed remarkable resilience. She still had moments of fear and uncertainty, especially at night when memories of sleeping in the park would creep back. But she was learning to trust again, to accept help, and to believe in the goodness of others. The teddy bear that Officer Chen had found her clutching that first night remained her constant companion, but now it represented hope rather than fear. Mrs. Lee's progress, though slow, was steady. The new treatment protocol was showing promising results, and her doctors were cautiously optimistic. More importantly, the weight of trying to manage everything alone had been lifted from her shoulders. She could focus on healing, knowing that Amy was safe and cared for. The story even reached the local news, though Officer Chen was reluctant to take any credit. A reporter interviewed him about finding Amy in the park, and his response captured the essence of community policing. "We're not just here to enforce laws," he said. "We're here to protect and serve our community in whatever way they need." Sometimes that means taking a moment to really see someone and reaching out a helping hand. The media coverage had an unexpected benefit. It inspired other communities to look more closely at their own hidden homeless populations, particularly families struggling with medical debt. Several neighboring towns began developing programs to identify and support families at risk of losing their homes due to healthcare costs. As winter approached, the memory of that cold night in the park seemed increasingly distant. Amy had settled into a routine at the Chen's home, helping Rose tend her small garden and doing her homework at the kitchen table. She still visited her mother every day after school, and the hospital staff had grown fond of the brave young girl who brought such life to their ward. One evening, as Amy helped Rose prepare dinner, she asked a question that had been on her mind: "Why did you and Officer Chen help us so much? You didn't even know us." Rose paused in her cooking and looked at Amy with gentle eyes. "Sweetheart, sometimes the right thing to do is also the only thing to do. When you see someone in need, you help, not because you have to, but because we're all part of the same community. And community means family, even if we're not related by blood." That simple explanation seemed to satisfy Amy, but it sparked something deeper in both Rose and Officer Chen. They realized that their initial act of kindness had created a ripple effect far beyond what they could have imagined. It wasn't just about helping one family anymore, it was about showing what was possible when people came together to support each other. As autumn turned to winter, the transformation in both Amy and Mrs. Lee became increasingly evident. The fear and uncertainty that had once clouded Amy's eyes were replaced by a quiet confidence. Mrs. Lee, too, was making remarkable progress, her determination strengthened by the knowledge that her daughter was safe and cared for. The day Mrs. Lee was scheduled to begin outpatient treatment marked a significant milestone. The hospital staff had grown so attached to her that they organized a small celebration for her discharge. Nurses who had cared for her brought homemade treats, and even some of the doctors stopped by to wish her well. The head nurse presented her with a handmade quilt, explaining that several staff members had contributed squares during their break times. "We've seen so many patients come and go," the head nurse said, her eyes glistening, "but your story, your determination, and especially your daughter's bravery, it reminded us why we chose this profession in the first place." Mrs. Lee clutched the quilt, overwhelmed by the gesture and unable to find words to express her gratitude. The transition to outpatient care brought new challenges, but also new opportunities. The apartment provided by the housing nonprofit was modest but felt like a palace to Amy and her mother. Local community members had donated furniture and household items, transforming the empty space into a real home. Amy's favorite addition was a small desk by the window, where she could do her homework while keeping an eye on her mother. Officer Chen and Rose remained constant presences in their lives, but their role was evolving. Instead of providing direct support, they were helping the Lee family rebuild their independence. Rose taught Mrs. Lee about managing her medical routine at home, while Officer Chen helped Amy develop a safety plan for various situations, a habit from his years on the force that brought comfort to both mother and daughter. The experience had changed Officer Chen as well. He began organizing workshops at the police department about identifying and helping vulnerable community members. His fellow officers, inspired by Amy's story, became more attuned to the signs of families in crisis. The department even started a new initiative, partnering with local social services to provide immediate assistance to families facing housing insecurity. Amy's school life had transformed dramatically. From being the quiet girl who tried to hide her situation, she had become an advocate for others. When she learned that another student was struggling with food insecurity, she immediately approached her teachers with a plan to create a discreet food pantry within the school. The initiative, supported by the school administration, soon became a model for other schools in the district. One particularly cold winter morning, Amy arrived at school to find a surprise. Her classmates had organized a proper birthday celebration for her. They had learned that she hadn't celebrated her birthday in 2 years due to their circumstances. The party was simple, cupcakes during lunch break and a few thoughtful gifts, but it represented something profound. Amy was no longer invisible. The celebration continued after school at the Chen's house, where Rose had prepared Amy's favorite dinner. As they gathered around the table, the Chens, Mrs. Lee, Amy, and even a few neighbors who had become close friends, Officer Chen noticed something remarkable. The teddy bear that Amy had clutched so tightly that first night in the park now sat forgotten on a shelf, replaced by the warm embrace of real human connections. Mrs. Lee's health continued to improve, though there were still difficult days. The clinical trial was showing promising results, and her doctors were optimistic about her long-term prognosis. More importantly, she had developed a support network that helped her manage both her medical needs and daily responsibilities. The burden of facing everything alone had been lifted, allowing her to focus on healing and rebuilding her life. The community's response to the Lee family situation had sparked lasting changes. Local business owners, inspired by their story, started a program to provide job training and employment opportunities to people recovering from medical crises. The hospital revised its policies regarding payment plans and financial assistance, making it easier for families to access care without facing financial ruin. One of the most significant developments came from an unexpected source. A local real estate developer, touched by Amy's story, decided to convert one of his properties into affordable housing units specifically for families affected by medical hardships. The project, named Amy's Haven, would provide stable housing and support services to families going through similar situations. As winter deepened, Amy and Mrs. Lee began making plans for the future. Mrs. Lee's improved health meant she could start thinking about returning to work part-time. The medical billing department where she had previously worked offered her a flexible position, allowing her to work from home when needed. The irony of her new role, helping other families navigate medical expenses, wasn't lost on anyone. Amy's academic performance had soared, and her teachers began discussing advanced placement classes for the following year. The same determination that had helped her survive on the streets now fueled her studies. She had developed a particular interest in social work, inspired by the people who had helped her family through their crisis. One evening, as snow fell softly outside their apartment window, Amy asked her mother a question that had been on her mind. "Mom, do you think we'll ever be able to help other people the way everyone helped us? Mrs. Lee smiled, pulling her daughter close. Sweetheart, we already are. Every time you speak up for someone at school, every time I help a family understand their medical bills, we're passing on the kindness we received. That's how hope grows, one person helping another, who then helps someone else. The truth of those words was evident in the changes throughout the community. The Lee family's story had become more than just a tale of hardship and rescue, it had become a catalyst for systemic change. Other towns began reaching out, asking for advice on implementing similar programs. What had started with one police officer noticing a small bundle of blankets in a park had grown into a movement of compassion and community action. Officer Chen, reflecting on everything that had unfolded, realized that this was the true meaning of protecting and serving. Sometimes the biggest impacts came not from dramatic rescues or high-profile cases, but from simple acts of human kindness, taking the time to notice, to care, and to take action. The badge he wore with such pride had never felt more meaningful. Spring arrived with a sense of renewal, bringing with it the groundbreaking ceremony for Amy's Haven. The once empty lot was transformed into a construction site, where the foundation for hope would soon take shape. Amy herself was invited to place the first ceremonial brick, her hands trembling slightly as she realized how many lives would be touched by this building. The project had grown beyond its initial scope. What started as a simple housing complex had evolved into a comprehensive support center. The ground floor would house a medical clinic offering reduced-cost care, a job training center, and counseling services. The upper floors would contain 20 affordable apartments, each designed to provide a stable environment for families rebuilding their lives. Mrs. Lee had become an integral part of the planning process, her personal experience providing valuable insights into what families in crisis truly needed. She worked closely with the developers, ensuring that every detail, from the layout of the apartments to the support services offered, would serve the residents' needs. Her own journey from crisis to recovery had given her a unique perspective that proved invaluable. The impact of their story continued to ripple through the community in unexpected ways. Local businesses began offering second chance job programs, inspired by Mrs. Lee's successful return to work. The hospital where she had received treatment implemented new protocols for identifying and supporting patients at risk of losing their homes due to medical bills. Even the school system had changed, with several schools adopting versions of Amy's food pantry program. Officer Chen's role had evolved as well. He was now leading a new community outreach division within the police department, training other officers to recognize and respond to families in crisis. His approach, emphasizing compassion and practical support over traditional enforcement, was gaining attention from police departments across the state. The badge gives us authority, he would tell his trainees, but it's our humanity that gives us the power to truly make a difference. He often used Amy's story as a teaching example, showing how a moment of attention and kindness could spark transformative change. Rose had returned to nursing part-time, specifically to work with families at the new clinic being built at Amy's Haven. Her experience with the Lee family had reignited her passion for healthcare, but with a new focus on addressing the social factors that affected people's well-being. She understood now that healing often required more than just medical treatment. Amy's own transformation continued to inspire those around her. Now in advanced placement classes, she had started a student advocacy group focused on supporting classmates facing personal challenges. The group organized everything from tutoring sessions to clothing drives, creating a safety net that would have made a difference in her own time of need. One particularly meaningful project emerged when Amy discovered that several students were secretly living in their families' cars. Working with her advocacy group and school administrators, she helped establish a confidential support system that connected these families with resources before their situations became as desperate as hers had been. The local media continued to follow the story, but now they were reporting on the positive changes spreading throughout the community. A documentary filmmaker even approached the Lee family about sharing their journey, seeing it as a powerful example of how communities could come together to support their vulnerable members. Mrs. Lee's health had stabilized, and she had become something of a patient advocate at the hospital. Working part-time in the billing department, she helped other families navigate the complex healthcare system and access available resources. Her gentle guidance and personal understanding of their struggles made a difficult process more manageable for countless families. The success of these initiatives attracted attention from neighboring communities. City officials and community leaders would visit to learn how they could implement similar programs in their own towns. Amy's Haven became a model for integrated support services, demonstrating how housing, healthcare, and community support could work together to create lasting change. One warm spring afternoon, as Amy and her mother walked through the construction site of Amy's Haven, they encountered a young family touring the facility. The mother, clutching medical bills and looking overwhelmed, reminded them both of their own situation just months ago. Without hesitation, Mrs. Lee approached them, offering not just information about the program, but also the understanding that comes from shared experience. As she watched her mother comfort the young family, Amy realized how far they had come. The fear and shame that had once defined their lives had been replaced by strength and purpose. Their story had become a beacon of hope for others facing similar challenges. The construction workers at Amy's Haven had taken to writing messages of hope on the building's support beams. Before they were covered by walls. Amy often walked through the site after school, reading these hidden messages that would forever be part of the building's foundation. "You are not alone," one beam declared in bright paint. "Hope starts here," read another. Officer Chen, visiting the construction site one evening, found Amy tracing these messages with her fingers. "You know," he said, sitting beside her on a stack of lumber, "that night in the park, I was just doing my job. I never imagined it would lead to all of this." Amy smiled, looking out over the busy construction site. "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments," she replied, echoing words she had heard her mother say. Like a police officer noticing a bundle of blankets in a park. The sun was setting behind the half-finished building, casting long shadows across the construction site. But unlike the shadows of that night in the park, these shadows held no fear. Instead, they represented the framework of hope being built, not just in concrete and steel, but in the hearts and minds of an entire community. As spring bloomed into early summer, Amy's Haven was taking shape, both physically and symbolically. Each brick laid, each beam raised, represented another step toward creating a safety net for families in crisis. The project had become more than just a building, it was a testament to what could happen when compassion met action, when individual kindness grew into community-wide change. The summer sun shone brightly on the day of Amy's Haven's grand opening. The once empty lot had been transformed into a beacon of hope, a modern 5-story building with a welcoming facade and carefully designed spaces that would soon become home to families in need. The ribbon-cutting ceremony attracted hundreds of community members, each person representing a thread in the tapestry of support that had made this day possible. Amy stood beside her mother, both of them hardly believing the magnitude of what their story had inspired. The building before them was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a promise to other families that they wouldn't have to face their struggles alone. Mrs. Lee, now fully recovered and radiating strength, squeezed her daughter's hand as they watched Officer Chen prepare to address the crowd. "A year ago," Officer Chen began, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "I found a young girl sleeping in our park." That moment could have been just another entry in a police report, but instead, it became the catalyst for something extraordinary. Today, we're not just opening a building, we're opening our hearts and our community to those who need it most. The first families were scheduled to move in the following week. Each had been carefully selected based on need, and each had a story that resonated with the building's purpose. There was a single father battling cancer while trying to care for his 2 children, a grandmother raising her grandchildren while managing chronic illness, and several other families whose medical challenges had pushed them to the brink of homelessness. The building's design reflected the lessons learned from the Lee family's experience. The medical clinic on the ground floor would provide accessible healthcare, staffed partly by volunteer doctors and nurses who had been touched by Amy's story. Rose had taken a position as the clinic's coordinator, ensuring that medical care would be delivered with both professional expertise and personal understanding. The Job Training Center, another ground-floor facility, had already begun scheduling classes. Local business owners had committed to providing internships and job opportunities to program graduates. Mrs. Lee would be one of the instructors, teaching a course on medical billing and patient advocacy, turning her own painful experience into valuable knowledge for others. Amy's role in the project had evolved in unexpected ways. Despite her young age, she had become an important voice in the building's youth programs. She worked with the social workers to design activities and support systems specifically for the children of families in crisis, understanding firsthand how important it was to maintain a sense of normalcy and hope. The community's involvement hadn't waned with the project's completion. Local churches had organized volunteer groups to help families move in. The school district had arranged transportation to ensure children could remain in their current schools during the transition. Even local restaurants had committed to providing meals during the first week as families settled into their new homes. Officer Chen's police department had become a model for community-oriented policing. Officers were now trained to recognize signs of family crisis and connect people with resources before their situations became desperate. The department had created a special unit dedicated to working with vulnerable populations, and other cities were sending their officers to learn from their approach. During the building tour that followed the ceremony, Amy led a group through the family center on the second floor. The space had been designed with input from child psychologists and included areas for homework help, counseling, and simply being a kid, something Amy knew was crucial for children going through difficult times. This room, she explained, showing them a cozy space filled with books and comfortable seating, is where kids can come when they need a quiet moment. Sometimes, when everything else feels overwhelming, just having a safe place to breathe can make all the difference. Her words carried the weight of personal experience, touching everyone who heard them. The apartment units themselves were thoughtfully designed to feel like homes rather than temporary housing. Each unit had a small balcony where residents could grow plants, a detail Mrs. Lee had insisted upon. After seeing how therapeutic gardening had been during her recovery at the Chen's home. The kitchens were equipped with basic supplies, and local artists had donated artwork to decorate the walls. One of the most innovative features was the community kitchen and dining area on the fourth floor. Here, families could cook and eat together if they chose, creating a support network that went beyond formal programs. The space would also be used for cooking classes, nutrition education, and community meals, all part of the holistic approach to helping families rebuild their lives. As the day drew to a close, Amy found herself standing in the building's rooftop garden. The space had been designed as a peaceful retreat for residents, with raised vegetable beds, comfortable seating, and a stunning view of the city. Looking out over the community that had come together to make this possible, she felt a profound sense of purpose. A small group of children from the families moving in next week were exploring the garden, their excitement evident as they discovered the butterfly-friendly plants and child-sized gardening tools. Watching them, Amy remembered the fear and uncertainty she had felt sleeping in the park, and her heart swelled knowing these children would have a different experience. Mrs. Lee joined her daughter at the railing, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You know," she said softly, "when we were at our lowest point, I never imagined we'd be standing here. But look at what happened because one person took the time to care." Their conversation was interrupted by Officer Chen, who had come to share some exciting news. The success of Amy's Haven had caught the attention of state officials, and there was talk of replicating the model in other cities. The ripple effect of that night in the park was still spreading, touching more lives than anyone could have predicted. As the sun set on the opening day, casting a warm glow over the new building, the gathered community members felt a shared sense of accomplishment. Amy's Haven wasn't just a solution to a problem, it was a testament to the power of human connection and community action. It stood as proof that even the darkest moments could lead to profound positive change. 1 month after its opening, Amy's Haven was already proving to be more than just a building, it had become a living, breathing community of hope. The halls echoed with children's laughter, the community kitchen filled with the aromas of shared meals, and the support groups in the family center helped residents realize they weren't alone in their struggles. The first success story came from the Johnson family, a grandmother and her 2 grandchildren who had been living in their car while she underwent chemotherapy. Within weeks of moving into Amy's Haven, she had connected with the medical clinic's oncology specialist, who helped adjust her treatment schedule to better manage her symptoms. Her grandchildren, initially withdrawn and anxious, were now regular participants in the after-school programs. Amy found herself spending most afternoons in the building's youth center, working alongside professional counselors to support children going through situations similar to what she had experienced. Her personal story resonated deeply with these young people, showing them that their current circumstances didn't define their future. One particular breakthrough came with a quiet 10-year-old boy who hadn't spoken much since moving in. Amy noticed him sitting alone in the reading corner, clutching a worn action figure the way she used to hold her teddy bear. Instead of forcing conversation, she simply sat nearby, drawing in her sketchbook. Days passed this way until one afternoon, he asked what she was drawing. "I'm designing a superhero," she explained, showing him her sketch. "Someone who helps kids who are going through tough times." The boy studied the drawing intently before asking if he could create his own superhero. That simple interaction bloomed into an art therapy program where children could express their feelings through creativity. Mrs. Lee had become the heart of the resident support system. Her office in the resource center was always open to residents needing guidance with medical bills, insurance forms, or just a sympathetic ear. She understood their fears and frustrations intimately, and her own journey from crisis to recovery gave them hope. The success of Amy's Haven caught the attention of state officials, who saw it as a potential model for addressing the intersection of healthcare and housing crises. A delegation of policymakers visited the facility, spending time with residents and staff to understand how the integrated support system worked in practice. Officer Chen's community policing program had expanded, with officers from other districts coming to learn his approach. He never failed to bring them to Amy's Haven, showing them firsthand how understanding and compassion could transform lives. "Our job isn't just to respond to crisis," he would tell them, "but to help prevent crisis whenever possible." The medical clinic, under Rose's coordination, had become a model of accessible healthcare. They had developed a system where resident families could access care without worrying about immediate payment, while working with financial counselors to develop manageable payment plans. The clinic also offered preventive care and wellness programs, helping families stay healthy and avoid medical emergencies. The rooftop garden had flourished into a therapeutic space where residents could find peace and purpose. Senior residents taught children about growing vegetables, creating bonds across generations. The fresh produce was used in cooking classes in the community kitchen, where families learned about nutrition and meal planning on a budget. One evening, during a community dinner in the 4th floor dining area, Mrs. Lee noticed something remarkable. Residents who had arrived just weeks ago looking beaten down by circumstances were now engaging in animated conversations, sharing recipes, and making plans for the future. The meal had been prepared by 3 families working together, using vegetables from the rooftop garden. The job training center was showing promising results. 2 residents had already secured full-time employment, while others were completing certification programs. Local businesses, seeing the success of the program, began offering more opportunities. A tech company even donated computers and offered coding classes, expanding the range of skills residents could develop. Amy's school advocacy group had grown beyond its original scope. Other schools in the district had started similar programs, creating a network of support for students facing housing and family medical challenges. The food pantry initiative had evolved into a comprehensive student support system, addressing everything from school supplies to emotional well-being. The documentary filmmaker who had been following their story captured a powerful moment during a support group session. A new resident, fighting back tears, shared how she had been sleeping in hospital waiting rooms while her son received treatment. Another resident immediately stood up and hugged her, saying, "You're home now. We've got you." The filmmaker later said it was this spirit of mutual support that made Amy's Haven unique. State representatives, impressed by the program's success, began drafting legislation to fund similar initiatives across the state. They consulted with Mrs. Lee and Officer Chen, incorporating their insights into policies that would help other communities replicate the model. The ripple effect of that night in the park was becoming a wave of change. The building's first-floor lobby had become a wall of hope, where residents could post their achievements and milestones. First job interview. First night without worry. First time my kids felt safe in months. Each note represented a step forward, a life being rebuilt. Amy often stood there, reading the messages and adding encouraging notes of her own. 1 year after that fateful night in the park, Amy stood in the same spot where Officer Chen had found her. The park had changed, new playground equipment had been installed, and security lighting made it safer at night. But more importantly, the community had changed. People were more aware, more willing to reach out, more understanding that anyone could face unexpected challenges. The teddy bear that had been her only comfort on that cold night now sat in a display case in Amy's Haven's lobby. Beside it was a simple plaque that read, "Hope begins with one person noticing, one person caring, one person acting. Be that person." It served as a reminder that the smallest actions could spark the biggest changes. As summer turned to fall again, Amy's Haven prepared to welcome more families. The waiting list was long, but each success story, each family restored to stability, proved that the model worked. What had started as one police officer's compassionate action had grown into a movement, showing that when communities come together, remarkable transformations were possible. On the 1-year anniversary of Amy's Haven, hundreds gathered to celebrate not just a building, but a revolution in community care. The parking lot had been transformed into a festival space, with local food vendors, musical performances, and information booths about the various programs that had sprung from that first act of kindness in the park. Amy, now a confident teenager, stood at the podium alongside Officer Chen, preparing to address the crowd. Looking out at the faces before her, residents, volunteers, community leaders, and supporters, she felt the weight of their collective journey. The scared girl from the park seemed like a distant memory, though she never forgot the lessons learned during those difficult times. "A year ago," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I thought I was alone in the world. I was trying to be invisible, thinking that was the only way to survive. But Officer Chen taught me something important that night: sometimes being seen is the first step toward being saved." She paused, smiling at the officer who had become like family. The statistics spoke volumes about the program's success. In its first year, Amy's Haven had helped 35 families transition from crisis to stability. The medical clinic had provided care to over 200 patients, while the job training center had helped 28 people secure stable employment. But numbers couldn't capture the real impact: the restored dignity, the renewed hope, the rebuilt lives. Mrs. Lee, now the program director for family services, shared stories of transformation. Like the single father who had been living in his van while taking his daughter to chemotherapy treatments, he was now employed at the hospital where she received care, helping other parents navigate the healthcare system. Or the elderly couple who had lost everything to medical debt but now ran the rooftop garden program, teaching others about sustainable living. The building itself had evolved, each space holding countless stories of healing and hope. The community kitchen had become a hub of cultural exchange, where families shared traditional recipes and cooking techniques. The youth center walls were covered with artwork created by resident children, their pieces expressing both their struggles and their dreams. Officer Chen's community policing program had expanded beyond the city limits. Police departments from across the country sent representatives to learn his approach, understanding that compassion could be as powerful as authority. His training programs emphasized the importance of seeing beyond the surface, of recognizing that every crisis was an opportunity to make a difference. Rose had developed a revolutionary healthcare model at the clinic, combining medical care with social support. Insurance companies were studying their approach, particularly how preventive care and stress reduction programs had reduced emergency room visits among resident families. The clinic had become a teaching site for medical students, showing future healthcare providers the importance of addressing social determinants of health. The success of Amy's Haven had inspired similar projects in neighboring cities. 3 new facilities were under construction, each adapted to their community-specific needs but following the same core principle, that healing requires more than just medical care or housing alone. The state legislature had passed the Community Care Act, providing funding for integrated support programs across the state. During the anniversary celebration, a new initiative was announced. The Night in the Park Scholarship Fund would provide educational support to children who had experienced housing insecurity due to family medical crises. Amy would serve on the selection committee, using her experience to help identify students who could benefit most from the opportunity. The documentary about Amy's Haven had been completed and was being shown at film festivals across the country. Its message resonated far beyond their community, sparking discussions about how society handles the intersection of healthcare and housing crises. More importantly, it showed that solutions were possible when communities came together with purpose and compassion. As the evening progressed, residents past and present shared their stories. Each tale was unique, but they all echoed the same themes: the shock of crisis, the fear of falling through society's cracks, and the profound relief of finding not just shelter, but a community of support. Their stories were no longer marked by shame or desperation, but by resilience and hope. Amy and her mother had moved into their own apartment several months ago, but they remained deeply involved with Amy's Haven. Their experience had given them a mission, to ensure that no other family would have to face similar challenges alone. Mrs. Lee's health remained stable, and she had become a powerful advocate for healthcare reform, testifying before state legislators about the need for comprehensive support systems. The rooftop garden, now a lush oasis of vegetables, flowers, and herbs, hosted a special dinner that evening. Tables were set among the plants, and residents served dishes made with ingredients they had grown themselves. As the sun set over the city, casting a golden glow across the gathered community, conversation flowed freely between people from all walks of life: residents, volunteers, officials, and supporters, all united by their commitment to making a difference. Officer Chen, watching the interactions around him, reflected on how a simple act of noticing could spark such profound change. He thought about all the times he had driven past that park before that fateful night, and how many others might have passed by without seeing. The lesson was clear: change begins with awareness, with taking the time to truly see those around us. As the celebration drew to a close, Amy returned to the podium for a final announcement. The teddy bear that had been her companion during those difficult nights would be retired from its display case. In its place would be a journal where visitors could share their own stories of hope and transformation. The bear had served its purpose, reminding everyone that even in our darkest moments, hope can be found. A year ago, she concluded, her voice carrying across the quiet crowd, I thought my story was one of loss and fear. But thanks to Officer Chen, my mom, the Chens, and every person here tonight, it became a story of hope and community. We've learned that no one should have to face their struggles alone, and that when we reach out to help others, we create ripples of change that touch countless lives. The applause that followed was more than just celebration, it was a renewal of commitment, a promise to continue the work they had begun. As the crowd dispersed into the warm evening, the lights of Amy's haven glowed brightly against the darkening sky, a beacon of hope for all who needed it. The story that began with a police officer noticing a small bundle of blankets in a park had transformed into a movement of compassion and change. It proved that sometimes the smallest actions could spark the biggest transformations, and that within every crisis lies the seed of hope, if only we take the time to notice, to care, and to act.